Racist officer stops black man, then learns he's the district's attorney. Emmanuel Carter rose before dawn, his alarm echoing softly through the tidy, two-bedroom condominium he called home. A modest but comfortable space lined with art pieces that evoked the soul of his grandmother's hometown in rural Georgia. Images that reminded him each morning of why he had pursued a career in law. Stepping into his slippers, he padded across the hardwood floor to the kitchen, where a single-cup coffee maker waited to greet him with a brisk jolt of energy that, in his mind, fueled both his sharp intellect and compassionate spirit. The fridge was stocked with health-conscious items, organic vegetables, lean proteins, and fruit-laden yogurts, but Emmanuel would often joke that his real vice was the tangy-sweet pastry he grabbed on Fridays from the local bakery near the courthouse. As he sipped his coffee, Emmanuel mentally outlined his day, making certain to review any pending court hearings or meetings scheduled with staff members, ensuring no client or colleague felt overlooked. Above the sink hung a framed photograph of him shaking hands with a retired judge who had once been his mentor, a constant reminder to stay humble and serve justice with unwavering dedication. Though widely recognized in legal circles, Emmanuel enjoyed working without grand fanfare. He believed that accessibility and empathy were cornerstones of his office, maintaining an open-door policy for citizens seeking his counsel. After scanning his email on his tablet, he spent a few minutes reading the local paper to stay abreast of community news. Articles ranged from local fundraisers to updates on recent civic unrest, subtle indicators of the challenges he faced as district attorney. He took a moment to respond to messages from staff, finding calm in the methodical rhythm of tapping out thoughtful replies, even when the content of the messages weighed heavily on his mind. Once fully caffeinated, he moved to his bedroom, selecting a tailored dark suit that was meticulously pressed the night before, choosing a modest tie to reflect the day's subdued schedule of meetings and administrative follow-ups. He remembered how his grandmother used to say that a well-dressed man commands respect without uttering a single word, a lesson he followed faithfully in a profession steeped in outward appearances. Dressing impeccably was not about vanity for Emmanuel. It was about honoring the people he served, showing them he took his role seriously. After slipping on his polished shoes, he carefully placed his district attorney's badge in the inner pocket of his jacket, aware that some days he needed its authoritative presence in unexpected moments. Catching his reflection in the mirror, he paused, rehearsing the calm, reassuring smile he hoped would alleviate the fears of the crime victims or witnesses he would meet later in the day. Outside, the summer morning air was warm, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and freshly turned soil from a neighbor's gardening project. A small hint of suburban serenity that seemed almost at odds with the legal battles he faced in his position. Emmanuel appreciated these brief, quiet interludes between home and the office, finding solace in every small sign of life's normalcy. Sliding into his car, he turned on the radio, preferring smooth jazz to chaotic news broadcasts first thing in the morning. The gentle saxophone melodies provided a soothing soundtrack to the commute, helping him collect his thoughts. His drive was methodical, guided by years of habit, left at the corner with the old oak tree, past the small library where he had once given a talk on constitutional law, and onto the tree-lined avenue that led to the courthouse district. He knew every pothole, every speed limit sign, and every street corner vendor who sold newspapers to passing motorists. Each landmark underscored his deep connection to the community he served, a place where the faces of neighbors and friends blurred into a tapestry of personal history. Nearing the courthouse, he flipped open the sun visor and glanced at his reflection once again, double-checking his composure. He wanted to appear composed and confident for a day of meetings, even if 100 unseen details threatened to unravel. Before parking in the reserved space behind the courthouse, Emmanuel considered how lucky he was to have made real strides in criminal justice reforms, including implementing programs designed to reduce recidivism and promote fairness. He prided himself on being approachable, a stance that sometimes drew skepticism from more hardened figures in law enforcement who thought formality and a show of power were necessary. The day's docket included a few sentencing hearings, discussions on local policing tactics, and a long-awaited meeting with community activists seeking more transparency in investigations of officer-related misconduct. He knew these were delicate matters that required both the firm hand of law and the empathetic ear of a public servant. Despite the high stakes, Emmanuel felt exhilarated at the prospect of generating real change, a feeling that never quite disappeared, even after years of service. He exited his car with a purposeful stride, nodding politely at a security guard near the rear entrance, who always greeted him with a kind wave and a respectful "Good morning, Mr. Carter," as if he were not the district's top prosecutor but a friendly neighbor from down the block. After a few steps, he turned back to pop the trunk, retrieving a slim briefcase that contained neatly labeled folders, each representing a case, a defendant, or a victim, each file a life forever altered by the justice system's decisions. With the files secured, he headed inside, exchanging a few warm pleasantries with the administrative staff who busily typed away at their computers, scheduling court appearances and sorting through endless paperwork. He made a mental note to check in with his lead investigator later about an upcoming high-profile case, the details of which were still murky in the public's eye. In the corridor leading to his office, the fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting a faint glow that washed over the day's constant shuffle of lawyers, paralegals, and weary defendants waiting their turn before a judge. Emmanuel's mind flickered to thoughts of systemic inequities he'd encountered in his work. These weren't theoretical issues in a textbook but real-life tragedies unfolding day after day. He felt a keen responsibility to ensure fairness and equality under the law, to use his position as district attorney not just as an enforcer of statutes, but also as a guide for ethical and progressive justice. Outside his door, a young legal intern approached him with a shy grin, holding a stack of documents that needed his signature before noon. Emmanuel welcomed her with a reassuring nod, gently easing her nerves with a few kind words of encouragement about her bright future in public service. Once inside his office, he surveyed the large bookshelf teeming with law journals and case histories, each spine representing a lesson gleaned from past triumphs and failures of the American legal system. It was an unspoken reminder that knowledge, tempered with compassion, could chip away at even the most ingrained prejudices and institutional barriers. Setting his briefcase down, Emmanuel carefully organized the day's priorities, well aware that the smallest oversight could mean a miscarriage of justice for those depending on him. He took pride in knowing that his staff respected him for both his fairness and his refusal to accept shortcuts in the pursuit of convictions. It wasn't about winning every case, but about ensuring the truth was served. In the back of his mind, he reflected on how far he had come since his early days as a public defender, fighting tooth and nail for those who couldn't afford a high-priced attorney. Memories of those struggles shaped his empathetic approach to prosecution, reminding him daily that defendants, too, have stories worth hearing. Though the hours ahead promised tension and heavy responsibility, Emmanuel's faith in the law's capacity to protect, reform, and uplift fueled his determination. Just as he eased into his chair and prepared for the first internal briefing of the day, his assistant gently knocked, carrying reports that required immediate attention. He smiled, quietly bracing for the continuous churn of official business, personal stories of desperation, and the constant balancing act between mercy and justice. Even with this mental load, he found reasons to be hopeful, glancing at his digital calendar that showed a post-work dinner plan with an old friend who served as a civil rights advocate. He believed in forging alliances across different arms of the legal and social system, hoping to mend fractures that had long plagued his district. The day was packed, but Emmanuel resolved to approach each challenge with the steady hand he had become known for, offering respect even to those who might be hostile or uncooperative. What he couldn't anticipate, though, was that a routine evening drive home would soon catapult him into a confrontation with one of the most deep-seated, toxic issues in law enforcement, a bigotry that often lurked behind a veneer of uniformed authority. In the quiet corners of his mind, Emmanuel knew that the struggle for justice was not confined to the courthouse. It roamed the streets, lived in everyday interactions, and demanded courage from anyone who glimpsed its harmful impact. Had he known what awaited him after the sun slipped below the horizon, perhaps he would have steeled himself even more firmly against the storm about to come. Instead, he prepared for his next meeting with quiet optimism, never imagining that the final moments of this day would forever alter the public's perception of him, Officer Bradley Henson, and the system they both served. As the clock in Emmanuel Carter's office ticked past the end of his standard workday, he decided to depart, believing the bulk of his responsibilities had been temporarily satisfied and that a rare evening free of last-minute crises lay ahead, a fleeting calm before what would become a night of turmoil. He bid a gentle farewell to the few staff members still busily drafting motions or combing through legal precedents, quietly easing out of the courthouse and feeling a subdued satisfaction at how productive the day had been. Sliding into his sedan, he briefly debated whether to call his friend, the civil rights advocate, and confirm dinner plans, but decided he would finalize those arrangements once he got home, craving a small pocket of silence to collect his thoughts after hours of back-to-back meetings. When he turned the key in the ignition, the engine's hum seemed to merge with the soft afterglow of streetlights that dotted the nearly empty parking lot, a stillness that soothed him as he mentally drifted to the warmth of his home and the promise of a laid-back evening. He drove at a measured pace down the main thoroughfare, the steady rhythm of traffic lights providing a comforting structure, while the occasional glow from a storefront reminded him that his district was far from dormant even after sundown. Passing the local corner store, he recalled the times he had volunteered to speak with youth groups about the intricacies of the justice system, realizing how easily perceptions could shift if not diligently guided toward truth and compassion. He made his way onto a quieter residential street, carefully obeying the posted speed limit of 35 miles per hour, glancing occasionally at the dashboard clock to confirm that he wasn't in any rush, enjoying a moment of relief that, for once, he had no urgent calls from law enforcement or frantic attorneys. Through his open window, the crisp night air carried traces of freshly cut grass and distant barbecue smoke, mingling into a comforting sense of suburban life settling into its nightly routine. He navigated past a narrow stretch flanked by tall hedges, a section of the route that always tested a driver's caution due to limited visibility. Yet he handled it with careful ease, never imagining that a patrol car was lurking close by. Midway through the winding block, he noticed the distinct red and blue flash of police lights in his rearview mirror, a visual jolt that interrupted his reverie and made his heart thump with a mixture of annoyance and cautious concern. The siren wailed, an abrasive interruption to the hushed atmosphere of the neighborhood, compelling Emmanuel to guide his car to the side of the road with a mixture of confusion and resignation at what seemed like an unwarranted stop. He rolled down his window, preparing his driver's license and registration, aware that his status as district attorney could diffuse tensions if the officer recognized him, but determined to follow standard procedure. He recalled that, in prior community meetings, citizens frequently complained about pretextual stops, and he now found himself on the other end of that unsettling experience, bracing for whatever rationale the officer might present. There was a sharp rap on the driver's side window, and Emmanuel lifted his gaze to see a severe countenance staring back, eyes cold and accusatory, as if searching for reasons to escalate an ordinary situation. Without waiting for Emmanuel to speak, the officer demanded to see his license and proof of insurance, making no attempt to greet him politely or explain the reason for the stop. Emmanuel calmly complied, handing over the documents with the same professional composure he maintained in court, though a flicker of unease passed through him at the officer's clipped tone. The name tag read Henson, and the man's stance conveyed a rigid sense of authority amplified by the absence of any visible courtesy or acknowledgement that he might be dealing with someone undeserving of suspicion. When Emmanuel politely inquired why he was being pulled over, the officer avoided the question, instead asking if the vehicle had current registration, even though Emmanuel had already extended the relevant paperwork. The tension mounted as the officer's expression hardened, his body language echoing the unspoken prejudice that had brought him to single out this particular driver. Emmanuel knew that, statistically, men of color were often stopped on flimsy pretexts, and a tremor of indignation flared within him as the officer's tone grew more confrontational. He gently mentioned that he was on his way home after a long day's work at the courthouse, hoping to shift the dynamics, but Officer Henson merely narrowed his eyes in disbelief. The officer's hands hovered near his holster, a small but potent gesture of implied force, a reminder that any misstep could spiral into a dangerous confrontation. Emmanuel tried to remain level-headed, thinking that if he calmly explained his role in the justice system, perhaps the officer would realize this was a baseless stop, but he sensed that such an explanation might also be interpreted as arrogance or defiance. The aggravation was unmistakable in Henson's voice when he told Emmanuel to exit the vehicle, directing him to stand by the trunk with his hands where they could be seen, even though the reasons for such a command were neither provided nor apparent. Emmanuel felt an unsettling wave of vulnerability as he stepped out, his palms outstretched and visible, acutely aware that any sudden movement could be misread as a threat. He quietly asserted that he had complied fully, that his registration and insurance were valid, and that he was unsure why the officer found it necessary to escalate. Henson cut him off, asking pointedly whether Emmanuel had been drinking, whether there were any illegal substances in the car, and whether he had a weapon, each question layered with suspicion. Emmanuel, forced to respond calmly, explained that he had no contraband and that he was an attorney returning from work, choosing his words carefully in hopes of de-escalating the confrontation. The officer's eyes scanned Emmanuel's clothing and the interior of the car as though searching for a hidden justification for the stop, while the tension in the air crackled with unspoken accusations. Despite never raising his voice or appearing aggressive, Emmanuel sensed that his mere presence, as a black man driving a decent sedan in a suburban area, had sparked the officer's hostility. A few neighbors peeked cautiously from their windows, drawn by the flashing lights, but reluctant to intervene, their silhouettes etched behind curtains like wary onlookers to an unfolding drama. Henson appeared to relish the authority of forcing Emmanuel to stand in the dark, occasionally glancing at the driver's license without acknowledging the name or professional title printed on it. Emmanuel suspected that had the officer bothered to truly read the license, the entire ordeal might have ended then and there, but the man was too entrenched in his preconceived notions to imagine anything but wrongdoing. Trying another angle, Emmanuel quietly mentioned that he was, in fact, the district attorney, but before he could clarify or show his official badge, Henson barked at him to remain silent, evidently interpreting the statement as a threat or a lie. Emmanuel felt his heart pound against his ribcage, anger flaring at the insult and the dangerous power imbalance that allowed an officer to treat him with such blatant disrespect. But he steadied his voice, continuing to comply. As a distant hum of traffic passed on a nearby road, Emmanuel caught the faint reflection of his own face in the patrol car's windows, straining to recognize himself in the swirl of frustration and disbelief that clouded his features. Meanwhile, Henson began a cursory search of Emmanuel's sedan from the outside, shining his flashlight through the windows, his every movement laden with the assumption that he would find something incriminating. Emmanuel stood there, arms still visible, seething internally that in all his years serving the justice system, championing fair policing, and advocating for community trust, he now stood pinned under the weight of the very bias he had sworn to fight. A pang of dread twisted in his stomach when the officer's request for backup crackled over the radio, signaling that this baseless stop might spiral into an even bigger spectacle if more officers arrived. He thought about all the citizens who had voiced similar complaints, remembering how he had promised them that things would change, that the law could be a tool for protection and equality. Yet here he was, stripped of dignity on a quiet street with no immediate recourse. The seconds stretched into minutes, each heartbeat intensifying the question of whether Henson's assumptions would morph into something more physically dangerous. Emmanuel tried once more, measured and respectful, to point out that any search of his car should follow probable cause, but the officer scoffed, responding with a threat to arrest him if he persisted in arguing. The situation crackled with an unspoken ultimatum: continue to protest the injustice and risk forceful retaliation, or remain silent and acquiesce, all while sacrificing the dignity of his position and basic rights. Emmanuel chose silence, reasoning that as district attorney, he understood the system well enough to resolve this later, despite the bitter frustration that scorched his pride. He barely moved a muscle when Henson's flashlight beam flickered over the passenger seat, the sudden glare catching on the corner of a folder Emmanuel had left open that morning, which contained some official documents. The officer paused, eyeing the paperwork as if he suspected evidence of wrongdoing, yet unwilling to read far enough to recognize the name of the office printed in bold on the letterhead. In that moment, Emmanuel realized just how powerful preconceived bias could be, how it rendered Henson willfully blind to the truth inches from his face. Every second that passed brought a new wave of resentment that such bigotry persisted within law enforcement, but Emmanuel channeled his anger into a stoic resolve, believing that if he avoided a catastrophic confrontation, he could address Henson's misconduct through formal channels. As another police cruiser rounded the corner, Henson waved it off, perhaps reconsidering the optics of overreacting to a single driver or feeling satisfied that he had exerted enough authority already. Turning back to Emmanuel, he handed over the license and documents with a look of dismissive contempt, as though he finally recognized his misjudgment but refused to concede he might have been in the wrong from the start. He muttered a brusque command for Emmanuel to watch himself next time, offering no explanation for the stop, no apology, and no acknowledgement that he had nearly violated the rights of the man standing before him. Emmanuel resisted the urge to lash out or announce his title at the top of his lungs, choosing instead to take his papers, place them carefully in his pocket, and return to the driver's seat. He closed the door, drawing a long breath as he stared at the wheel, half expecting Henson to invent another pretext to continue the intimidation, but the officer merely stalked back to his own vehicle. Emmanuel turned the key, hands shaking slightly, and steered away from the curb, glancing in the rearview mirror one last time to see the patrol car fade into the distance. The experience lodged a heavy weight in his chest, a stark reminder that he was never immune to the injustice that so many in his community faced every day, no matter his position or accolades. Yet, even as he drove on, a sense of outrage mingled with determination, for he knew this encounter would not be the end of the story, and that a spark had been lit beneath an officer's prejudice that would soon ignite into a much larger blaze. He recognized that nothing could truly prepare a person for the primal fear of facing raw discrimination, and he began to rehearse, in his mind, how he would hold Henson accountable once the officer realized exactly who he had tried to intimidate. His jaw tightened as he counted the years of work he'd spent tirelessly advocating for police reform, only to find himself on the receiving end of precisely the kind of harassment that undermined public trust in law enforcement. The green glow of a traffic light ahead shone like a distant beacon, offering at least a symbolic reprieve from the darkness of the confrontation, and Emmanuel accelerated toward it with the unwavering focus of a man braced for the next crucial step in a battle against systemic rot. Emmanuel had scarcely driven 2 blocks away when he noticed the familiar glow of headlights trailing ominously behind, a sight that made his pulse pound anew as he realized it was Officer Henson's patrol car lingering like an unwanted shadow. He tried to keep his composure, but he couldn't shake the feeling that every turn of his steering wheel was being watched and judged, and that the officer might be scouring for the slightest pretense to pull him over again. When he stopped at a red light, the tension only mounted, for he could see Henson's silhouette in the rearview mirror, stiff and unyielding behind the wheel, perhaps stewing over Emmanuel's calm demeanor during the initial stop. Emmanuel clenched his fingers around the steering wheel, running through possible scenarios of how to defuse another confrontation, hoping desperately that his status as district attorney would not only clarify who he was but also underline the gravity of the officer's continued harassment. His heart sank further when, instead of branching off onto a different route, Henson switched lanes and accelerated, positioning himself closely behind Emmanuel's sedan as if preparing for another traffic stop. The unnerving persistence of those flashing headlights flickering in his mirrors triggered a wave of dread and indignation, intensifying the suspicion that this was less a routine observation than the pursuit of a personal vendetta. As soon as the light turned green, Emmanuel guided his car down a side street, hoping that heading into a more populated area might dissuade Henson from initiating another pointless confrontation. Much to his dismay, the officer kept pace, and after a few tense moments, those red and blue lights flared up again, piercing the night with the same accusing glare as before. Emmanuel swallowed a surge of frustration and anxiety, reminding himself that he had done nothing wrong, but the echo of the siren cutting through the quiet neighborhood weighed heavily on his nerves. The second stop occurred under a half-lit street lamp, the feeble glow casting elongated shadows across the sidewalk, where a couple of startled bystanders paused in uneasy curiosity. Henson approached this time with an even more aggressive posture, barking commands for Emmanuel to exit the car with his hands clearly visible, unwilling to let him speak or question the necessity of another stop so soon. Emmanuel tried to interject, to say that he hadn't violated any traffic laws, that he was indeed the district attorney, and that there must be some misunderstanding, but each word fell on the officer's deaf ears. The blatant disregard for standard protocol seared Emmanuel with a sense of helpless fury, for it became undeniable that Henson's intentions were fueled by prejudice rather than legitimate suspicion. Forced once again to step onto the sidewalk, Emmanuel found himself surrounded by an escalating sense of threat, aware that the officer's unpredictability could spark a dire confrontation at any second. Aware that the memory of high-profile incidents involving police brutality loomed large in the public consciousness, Emmanuel's mind flickered with the haunting possibility that one misread motion could unleash a catastrophe. The onlookers, though few in number, seemed keenly aware of the tension crackling in the air, and at least one of them had pulled out a phone to record, a small comfort to Emmanuel that a neutral set of eyes might capture the unfolding events. Henson's voice rang out, sharper than before, demanding once more that Emmanuel identify himself, though every attempt Emmanuel made to comply was met with shouted interruptions and scornful disbelief. The pounding of Emmanuel's heart almost drowned out the officer's words, yet he maintained a steady calm in his tone, determined to prove that defiance would give the man all the ammunition he needed to escalate even further. When Emmanuel finally managed to extract his official badge from his inner jacket pocket, carefully extending it for the officer to see, Henson smacked it away with the back of his hand, sneering that he wouldn't be fooled by some counterfeit insignia. Outrage tore through Emmanuel's composure, for it was one thing to be suspected of wrongdoing and quite another to have his legitimate credentials dismissed as an attempt at deception, particularly when that credential confirmed the powerful role he held within the very system Henson served. The officer reached for his radio with a curt, "I've got a suspect here refusing to cooperate," twisting the narrative into one that painted Emmanuel as a criminal rather than the district's chief law enforcement official. Emmanuel's heart thudded in his chest, and he could almost feel the cold grip of handcuffs on his wrists before they were even snapped into place, the humiliating prospect of a false arrest looming perilously close. He tried speaking in a measured tone, urging Henson to check his license or call the precinct for verification, but the officer seemed bent on ignoring every rational overture, his hostility mounting with every second that Emmanuel tried to explain himself. The onlookers exchanged anxious glances, some edging forward as if considering whether to intervene, yet none dared disrupt the scene, perhaps fearing that any interference might stoke the confrontation further. Emmanuel had faced tough cross-examinations in court and heated community meetings, but nothing prepared him for the raw vulnerability of being singled out by an armed officer whose prejudice blinded him to truth. As the tension tightened around him like a cord, Emmanuel considered the horrible possibility that he might actually be brought into custody, forced through the indignity of a police station booking while onlookers speculated about his unknown crime. The mere thought that his colleagues, staff, and the wider community could see the district attorney paraded before them in handcuffs turned his stomach, especially knowing it would only prove how unchecked bigotry could victimize anyone, no matter their position. Voices crackled over the police radio, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the suspect Henson described was their own district attorney, intensifying the surreal sense that Emmanuel had slipped into an alternate reality where all reason was replaced by suspicion. Henson then ordered Emmanuel to turn around and place his hands on the roof of the sedan, patting him down in a blatant show of force, going through the motions of a weapons search that reeked of intimidation rather than genuine necessity. Emmanuel's breath caught in his throat at the public spectacle of it, the paternal hand of the law reduced to a humiliating pat-down that belittled him as though he were a dangerous fugitive. Each passing moment eroded the careful composure Emmanuel had nurtured, and though he still clung to the hope that someone or something would intervene, his spine tensed with the awareness that there might be no immediate reprieve. The phone in his pocket buzzed, likely his worried friend wondering where he was, but the officer's furious scrutiny never wavered, ensuring Emmanuel couldn't so much as glance at the screen. In that moment, the uniform, the badge, and the power Henson wielded felt like impenetrable barriers, towers of authority overshadowing Emmanuel's rightful claim to the highest law enforcement office in the county. Emmanuel's eyes flicked to the watchers on the sidewalk, who stood in stunned silence, occasionally murmuring to one another as if struggling to reconcile the claims that this was a routine stop with the reality of the officer's aggressive posture. A swirl of anxiety, anger, and humiliation cascaded through Emmanuel as Henson retrieved the radio once more, as though deciding whether to call for backup or proceed with an arrest on his own. Despite the churning storm of emotions, Emmanuel managed to center himself and spoke calmly again, insisting that Henson verify his identity through official channels rather than relying on assumptions. The officer spat out words that dripped with contempt, accusing Emmanuel of forging documents, telling him that impersonating a district official would carry serious consequences, and concluding with a derogatory remark about people like you. At that final phrase, Emmanuel felt a sharp chill ripple through his body, an echo of the countless stories he had heard from individuals in his community, whose only crime was being on the receiving end of an officer's prejudice. In a moment of reckless desperation, Emmanuel raised his voice, telling Henson that if he refused to verify the badge with the courthouse records, then he was knowingly violating the rights of the man he was sworn to serve and protect. Henson's response was immediate and volatile. He lunged forward to grab Emmanuel's arm, twisting it behind his back in a maneuver that almost sent him sprawling against the car. The abrupt pain and the rough force of the action jarred Emmanuel's sense of safety, and for a split second, he believed his fate might spiral into the sort of violent tragedy that headlines newspapers for weeks. The gathering onlookers let out a collective gasp, and their murmurs rose to an audible pitch as more phones emerged to record what looked like a blatant case of police misconduct. Emmanuel closed his eyes, bracing himself for the bite of handcuffs around his wrists, when the crackle of the radio interrupted, calling for Officer Henson by name. Through the static, a calm dispatcher's voice relayed a message that the district attorney was currently in transit after leaving the courthouse, prompting an inquiry if Henson had seen him. The abrupt confusion that flashed across Henson's face offered a fleeting glimmer of hope, for he paused, letting go of Emmanuel's arm to grab his radio, stammering something unintelligible in response. Emmanuel gasped for breath, straightening himself as the crowd on the sidewalk collectively held theirs, uncertain how the next few seconds would unfold. Slowly, Henson turned to stare at the man he had pinned, glancing from Emmanuel's battered badge on the ground to the license with the unmistakable name that matched the dispatcher's broadcast, and for an instant, shock clouded his eyes. While the officer still wore his contempt like a shield, a tremor of realization flickered across his features, revealing the first sign that he understood the magnitude of his error. Emmanuel held his bruised arm and steadied himself, every muscle in his body trembling with residual adrenaline, his mind racing with the knowledge that this confrontation had come so close to ending in irreversible disaster. Even as he recognized Henson's confusion, Emmanuel felt no relief. The damage had already been done, the humiliating frisk, the racial undertones, the near arrest of an innocent man who, ironically, happened to be the highest-ranking prosecutor in the district. Henson's voice quavered as he muttered about verifying credentials, as though searching for any last shred of an excuse. Yet the onlookers were no longer silent, and their collective outcry began to crescendo. Emmanuel glanced around, absorbing the weight of the moment. A uniformed officer standing in the cold glare of a street lamp, forced to confront the fact that his entrenched bias had almost led to a grave miscarriage of justice. Though the radio continued to sputter, asking for confirmation, Emmanuel could only stand there, still reeling from the rough treatment, and wonder how the next few moments would redefine not just this night, but the entire community's perspective on the supposed guardians of the law. A hush fell over the entire block, the previously hushed onlookers realizing that the furious officer had unwittingly targeted the very official who wielded the power to prosecute his wrongdoing, sending a collective ripple of astonishment through the summer air. In that moment, Henson's confident posture dissolved into a tangled knot of panic, his eyes darting to the phone screens capturing his every move, realizing too late that his radio call had effectively revealed Emmanuel's true identity to everyone present. The shift from domineering aggression to anxious uncertainty happened in an instant, and the onlookers, many of whom had begun recording out of concern for Emmanuel's welfare, now found themselves documenting the officer's shocked reaction and clumsy attempts at self-justification. Emmanuel remained pressed against the hood of his car, still trembling from the forceful grip on his arms, his thoughts racing between outrage, embarrassment, and a staggering sense of relief that the dispatcher's message might have prevented an even more catastrophic turn of events. Henson stood rigid, fingers twitching near the radio, his bravado gone as he mulled over whether to admit his mistake or attempt some last-ditch facade of composure to maintain an illusion of control. The sudden silence was broken only by the low hum of distant traffic and the restless stirring of neighbors who had spilled onto front porches, drawn by the swirling red and blue lights and the gathering crowd. Someone in the onlookers began to speak, pointing a trembling finger at the officer and demanding to know how he could have possibly detained the district attorney with such blatant hostility, and Henson's face twisted as he struggled to formulate a coherent response. The video recording phones captured every fraction of his pained expression, the piercing beam of the street lamp illuminating beads of sweat that had begun to form on his brow in a stark contrast to his earlier swagger. Emmanuel slowly stood upright, gripping the handle of his sedan for support, aware that even though he was free from Henson's immediate grasp, his body still bore the stinging impressions of the officer's forceful hands. Deep in the recesses of his mind, Emmanuel recalled the countless times constituents told him about officers whose biases had led them to overstep their authority, and he was struck by a potent mix of anger and validation that he had now experienced the exact injustice he fought against. A swirl of murmured voices intermingled with the officer's terse breathing, and every set of eyes in the vicinity watched with rapt attention for the next move in this unprecedented standoff. Henson, face taut with apprehension, glanced at the battered badge lying on the ground near Emmanuel's feet, evidence of the singular mistake that could easily cost him his career, his reputation, and more. Emmanuel, sensing the officer's crumbling confidence, took a measured breath and stooped down with deliberate care to retrieve his badge, holding it with a tremor of pride and anger as he turned it toward the onlookers for all to see. A collective gasp rose from the spectators, some of whom had not yet fully grasped the magnitude of Henson's blunder, until that piece of metal confirmed that the man he humiliated was not just another driver but the district's highest representative of law and order. For an instant, Emmanuel locked eyes with Henson, observing the swirl of panic and disbelief that flitted across the officer's features, and in that silent exchange, both men recognized that there was no way to undo what had just occurred. Even the faint chatter of the police radio in Henson's patrol car seemed to recede into the background, overshadowed by the enormity of the reality that had settled over the scene like a suffocating blanket of tension. A younger bystander, clutching a smartphone, shouted incredulously that justice was about to be served, and that the officer would finally face the consequences of his bigotry, a statement that triggered a murmur of agreement among the crowd. Emmanuel pressed his lips together, uncertain how to respond, as he was simultaneously aware of his position's authority and struck by the deeply personal indignity he had just endured. The officer abruptly broke his paralysis by stepping backward, almost stumbling as he put distance between himself and Emmanuel, like a man recoiling from the searing heat of his own misdeed. With forced bravado, Henson cleared his throat, barking out an order for everyone to remain calm, though it was clear to all present that he was the one most desperately in need of composure. It seemed for a moment that Henson might try to arrest Emmanuel anyway, perhaps clinging to the flimsy possibility of some technical infraction that would absolve him of blame, yet he only hesitated, torn between procedure and the gnawing awareness that his career now hung by a thread. The tension reached a crescendo when 2 additional patrol cars arrived, summoned by Henson's earlier calls for backup, their lights illuminating the street with a surreal glow that cast dancing shadows across the sidewalks and homes. Officers stepped out, confusion plastered on their faces as they surveyed the strange tableau. A panicked colleague, a bruised and outraged district attorney, and a cluster of citizens, phones raised, eyes full of outrage. One of the newly arrived officers approached with caution, noticing the clear hostility emanating from the crowd, and asked in a low voice what was going on, prompting Henson to stammer a half-baked explanation about a misunderstanding. Before Henson could spin a tale to shield himself, a shaky video replay began emerging on the bystanders' phones, some of them uploading clips directly onto social media feeds, ensuring that the night's events would go viral before sunrise. Emmanuel, though trembling and filled with fury, shifted his focus to preventing further mayhem, recognizing that his own safety and the integrity of his office could be compromised if tempers continued to flare. Taking a shaky breath, he turned to the newly arrived officers and calmly introduced himself by name and title, ensuring there was no ambiguity, and asked them to kindly step aside with him to address what had transpired. Henson hovered in the background, face ashen, eyes darting anxiously from Emmanuel to the crowd, perhaps weighing the possibility of flight, though every rational thought told him he could not simply disappear from the scene of his misconduct. In hushed tones, Emmanuel described the series of events to the other officers. The unwarranted stop, the second stop, the refusal to check his credentials, the physical aggression, and the repeated insinuations of criminality that carried a distinctly racist undertone. Though the backup officers tried to maintain neutrality, Emmanuel saw in their faltering expressions a sense of dismay that a colleague could so thoroughly disregard both training and basic respect for human dignity. A storm of conflicting emotions churned within Emmanuel, who felt an instinctive desire to see Henson reprimanded on the spot while also grappling with the desire to keep the situation from exploding into more violence or chaos. The crowd, emboldened by Emmanuel's presence, began to chant and demand accountability, pointing their cameras at Henson, who now stood against his patrol car like a caged animal, occasionally muttering soft denials under his breath. The glaring spotlight of social media had already begun to consume him. Snippets of his discriminatory behavior zipped across platforms in real time, accompanied by outraged commentary from viewers who recognized Emmanuel's name the instant it was mentioned. Sensing the tide turning irrevocably, Henson tried to speak, to weave an apology from the wreckage of his arrogance. But his words collapsed under the strain of anger and fear that dominated the air. Emmanuel, feeling the tightness in his chest easing just slightly, looked at the officer with a measured stare, torn between righteous fury and the ideals of fairness he had spent his career defending. He declared in a voice loud enough for the crowd to hear that this matter would be investigated promptly and thoroughly, that no one, not even a sworn officer of the law, stood above the system of justice meant to protect the public. A few bystanders cheered, though others shouted more confrontational demands, including calls for Henson to be arrested immediately, their faces contorted with the frustration that Emmanuel had so frequently encountered in community forums when discussing police misconduct. The newly arrived officers exchanged pointed glances, then suggested that Henson ride with them back to the station, and he mutely complied, stepping away from his own cruiser as if it were radioactive, leaving it parked haphazardly on the street. Emmanuel watched him go, feeling a swirl of conflicting emotions. Satisfaction that at least some justice had been served, anger that this incident had occurred at all, and a deep weariness at the reminder of just how entrenched bias remained in the force. By now, half the neighborhood seemed to have emerged onto their front lawns or sidewalks, and Emmanuel did his best to appear calm, though the bruises on his arms throbbed with a dull ache. Someone offered him a bottle of water, their voice quaking with concern, and he accepted it graciously, thanking them with the subdued kindness of a man who had not quite processed the night's events. The second squad car pulled away, escorting Henson toward the station, and the roar of conversation rose among the bystanders, many of whom recognized Emmanuel from local news segments about community reform but had never expected to witness him in such a vulnerable position. He took a moment to reassure them that he was all right, promising that he would not let this incident be buried, and that every attempt to seek transparency and truth would be put forth in the coming days. Though he managed a faint smile, something inside him quivered with the knowledge that tonight's events would set off a chain reaction, flinging the spotlight squarely on his office, the police department, and the broader tensions that plagued the criminal justice system. In that respect, the abrupt reversal of fortunes, the moment Henson recognized the gravity of assaulting the district attorney, would not simply end here on this dimly lit street corner, but rather would reverberate through city hall meetings, news outlets, and community rallies for weeks, months, and possibly years to come. Emmanuel steadied himself against his sedan's hood, gazing at the fading swirl of red and blue in the distance, feeling the weight of something monumental pressing down on him, a heavy manifestation of the fracture lines within law enforcement that he had long tried to mend. The final hush that settled over the crowd mirrored Emmanuel's own sense of disbelief, a stillness ripe with anticipation, broken only by the crisp chirp of insects and the muffled hum of phone notifications as footage of the altercation spread in digital waves. He saw in the gawking faces around him a flicker of hope that this injustice, captured so openly for all to see, might serve as a catalyst for more meaningful reforms than any amount of policy debate could inspire. Closing his eyes for a moment, Emmanuel breathed in the balmy air, letting the tension drain from his weary muscles, yet knowing that the real battle, the pursuit of disciplinary action against an officer whose prejudice had almost cost him far more than a bruised arm, was only just beginning. Emboldened by the clamoring voices of witnesses, he stood straighter, reciting silently the foundational oath of his office to uphold justice and protect the community, a reminder that he would bear the burden of rectifying this incident not just for himself, but on behalf of everyone who shared his skin color and faced the same threat of profiling. Then, with one last glance at the illuminated phones capturing every angle, he slid back into his sedan, a swirl of conflicting emotions in his chest, as the crowd parted to let him pass, their whispers urging him on as a figure who would not let this injustice fade. Even as he drove away, shoulders stiff with lingering adrenaline, he could envision the headlines splashed across tomorrow's news, the righteous uproar, the department's frantic damage control, and the myriad ways this night would resonate in the hearts of a community that had long craved tangible proof of accountability. Yet, amidst the brewing chaos, Emmanuel felt a steely resolve take shape. The process of honest reckoning and transformation would require confronting the ugly underbelly of discrimination, shining a light on it until genuine change replaced complacent denial. The sounds of murmuring neighbors and sirens receded into memory as he navigated toward home, each passing streetlight seeming to cast a stark reflection of the choice made by Henson and the deeper societal ailments that made such choices all too common. It was only upon arriving at his driveway, far from the hushed crowd and the glaring patrol lights, that Emmanuel allowed himself to collapse against the steering wheel, eyes brimming with emotion, a single figure in the darkness reckoning with both trauma and duty. Still, in the corners of his mind, a fierce certainty crystallized, reminding him that no matter the personal toll, he would not let the gravity of this incident be dismissed or diluted, for he had borne the humiliation of racism firsthand, and as district attorney, he was in a unique position to shine a bright, unflinching light on it. The morning after the confrontation with Officer Henson arrived with a gray, overcast sky, and Emmanuel awoke to a flurry of missed calls, texts, and voicemails, each one brimming with urgent inquiries, sympathetic outpourings, and demands for immediate comment on what had transpired in that suburban street. He found his phone flooded not just by friends and colleagues, but by local journalists, national reporters, and a maelstrom of social media messages that ranged from supportive solidarity to virulent condemnation of the officer's actions. Evidence of how quickly the story had gone viral. Even before Emmanuel could grab his first cup of coffee, a staff member from his office called to relay that news vans had assembled outside the courthouse, their antennae raised skyward, ready to broadcast every angle of the evolving saga. The official statement he had prepared the night before, typed in the haze of exhaustion and lingering trauma, hardly seemed adequate to quell the fervor of a media cycle that had seized upon this story with unstoppable momentum. His phone continued buzzing with notifications, some containing clips from news stations already airing the footage of him being detained and shoved against his own car. The images accompanied by anchor voices denouncing Henson's racial bias and shockingly brazen disregard for procedure. Driving into work felt surreal, for where he would normally take a straightforward route, he found himself rerouting to avoid an onslaught of reporters perched at various intersections, cameras ready to pounce on any sign of his vehicle. When he finally pulled into the courthouse parking lot, a small throng of protesters stood at the entrance, brandishing signs that read, "Stop Police Racism," and "Justice for All," their chants echoing through the morning air as Emmanuel stepped out of his sedan. He forced a polite wave in their direction, heart surging with a complicated blend of gratitude for their support and sorrow that such a demonstration was necessary to spotlight injustices that should never occur. The courthouse lobby buzzed with hushed excitement, a place usually governed by the stiff decorum of court proceedings now filled with murmurs about the district attorney's harrowing encounter, and Emmanuel could practically feel the tension humming against his skin. Once in his office, he was met by a sea of concerned faces. Investigators who had worked alongside him on past misconduct cases, assistants who had been up all night drafting official responses, and community liaisons who fielded dozens of calls from local leaders demanding updates. Every question felt heavier than the last, from whether he would press criminal charges against Henson to how this incident would affect public trust. And Emmanuel realized that the eyes of an entire nation now tracked his every move. Internal emails piled up, with some city officials requesting an immediate press conference to address the public outrage, while others insisted on a more measured approach, worried that any misstep could fan the flames of already simmering racial tensions. Emmanuel conferred with his lead communications advisor, who wore a look of profound unease, cautioning that the media was hungry for a spectacle, not a carefully worded statement, and that any slip of phrasing could overshadow the core injustice at hand. Outside his window, more protesters gathered, joined by curious onlookers, while camera crews jockeyed for position, hoping to catch even a fleeting glimpse of Emmanuel through the tall glass panes of the courthouse facade. Some staff members urged Emmanuel to remain inside for his own safety, fearing that a direct confrontation with the press might turn chaotic, but he felt an ethical responsibility to address the incident in person rather than behind the sterile veil of an official memo. Tension wove through the corridors as soon as word spread that Emmanuel would speak publicly, staffers anxiously preparing a small podium just outside the main doors, where a microphone and cluster of reporters already waited. The moment he stepped out, a storm of flash photography burst from every angle, the noise of cameras clicking and journalists shouting questions forming a deafening cacophony that nearly swallowed his quiet greeting. He let his gaze flick over the crowd, noticing a striking diversity of faces, some outraged, some curious, some skeptical, reflecting the community's broad range of emotions about policing and prejudice. The words he uttered next, though carefully chosen, emerged from a place of raw personal truth, as he condemned the blatant racial profiling and excessive force displayed by Henson, vowing a thorough, transparent investigation that would uphold the integrity of his office. Reporters lobbed question after question, pushing him to reveal whether Henson would be arrested, whether the city would face civil lawsuits, and whether Emmanuel believed that a broader pattern of racism pervaded the department. Emmanuel kept his composure, explaining that the case would be handled according to established protocols, but that his position as a victim also forced him to appoint an independent counsel to prevent any conflict of interest, ensuring fairness in the investigative process. Every word felt like balancing on a tightrope, for he knew the public demanded swift and decisive action against Henson, yet he also recognized the need to maintain a process that would stand up to scrutiny in court. A hush fell over the crowd when Emmanuel recounted how he felt in that moment of being detained, a wave of vulnerability crashing over him as he realized that even his station in life couldn't shield him from systemic bias. That confession seemed to resonate powerfully, and the protesters, who moments before had been chanting slogans, lowered their signs in silent empathy, forging a moment of solidarity that bridged the gap between the district attorney's formal role and the community's lived experiences. When Emmanuel finished his short address and turned away from the microphones, the press erupted once more, clamoring for further statements, but he retreated into the courthouse, aware that all the explanations in the world would not quell the anger lingering in the streets if concrete action did not follow. Inside, his office quickly turned into a war room, staff forming committees to handle the overwhelming flow of evidence and witness statements, while others grappled with the pragmatic logistics of investigating someone within the police force. Rumors flew that Henson was on administrative leave and had secured legal representation, sparking debate over how he might defend his actions in the face of such damning evidence, especially with half a dozen phone videos capturing the altercation. Emmanuel's phone pinged incessantly. Messages from civil rights organizations offering support, from federal agencies inquiring about the potential for broader civil rights violations, and from local activists who insisted that this be the catalyst for a deep restructuring of law enforcement protocols. Meanwhile, the police department itself had been thrust into the spotlight, forced to issue terse public statements promising full cooperation, while behind closed doors, officials scrambled to manage a looming public relations disaster that implicated their training programs, cultural climate, and overall supervision. Throughout the day, a steady stream of officers passed by Emmanuel's office in hushed solemnity, some looking him in the eye to express regret over the situation, others avoiding him entirely, leaving behind a palpable sense of shame and apprehension. Emmanuel, faced with a dilemma he had never before encountered, had to navigate the precarious intersection of being both a high-ranking figure in the justice system and the traumatized complainant in a case that had exploded onto the national scene. Television news panels began featuring legal analysts dissecting every angle, from the constitutionality of Henson's repeated stops to the racial undertones that had manifested in the confrontation, intensifying public scrutiny and fueling deeper debates about law enforcement bias. Social media platforms buzzed with discussions of Emmanuel's grace under pressure, many praising him for not escalating the situation, while others lamented that such a humiliating episode was required for the public to finally acknowledge rampant discrimination in policing. Late into the evening, Emmanuel held emergency meetings with city council members and the police commissioner, both desperate to demonstrate actionable reform, yet unsure how to move forward without sparking ire from powerful police unions. Each discussion carried the weight of historical pain, for many in the community had grown cynical over repeated reassurances that this time would be different, only to watch tragedies slip into obscurity once the headlines faded. Emmanuel's presence in these conversations made it impossible to ignore the human toll of bigotry, for he spoke from the dual vantage of a man intimately familiar with the system's legal framework and a victim still nursing physical and emotional bruises. In the days that followed, local channels replayed the footage relentlessly, talking heads pointing out key moments of misconduct, dissecting the officer's body language, and measuring Emmanuel's calm responses for hidden signs of fear or anger. Protests continued outside the courthouse, some escalating in size and urgency, culminating in peaceful marches where Emmanuel's name was invoked as a symbol of both resilience and the urgent call for sweeping reform. Meanwhile, Henson's attorney took to the airwaves, suggesting that the officer had been on heightened alert due to a surge in crime statistics, a defense that only ignited public fury by implying that racial profiling was a necessary policing tactic. The department announced an internal review, prompting Emmanuel to remind them that his office would not tolerate a mere cosmetic inquiry designed to placate the media, but would instead demand a substantive, transparent investigation culminating in potential criminal charges if warranted. More officers came forward, some anonymously, attesting that Henson had a long history of racially charged complaints, though none had resulted in disciplinary action, casting an even harsher spotlight on the department's opaque disciplinary processes. Emmanuel convened with community leaders, faith-based organizations, and legal advocacy groups, each meeting underscoring the necessity of forging an actionable blueprint for change that would address deeper roots of cultural bias rather than merely punishing a single officer. The tension felt ceaseless, gripping the city like a vice, with every daily development fueling speculation, disagreement, and fragile hope, as the public anxiously awaited concrete steps that would prove the justice system was capable of policing its own. Citywide polls showed that trust in law enforcement had plummeted, even among demographics historically inclined to support tough policing, while a surge of new voices demanded that Emmanuel champion additional oversight measures and stringent accountability reforms. By the end of that tumultuous week, the mayor openly acknowledged that the city's reputation depended on how effectively the district attorney's office handled this explosive case, and activists warned that any sign of leniency could spark civil unrest. Emmanuel found himself spending sleepless nights pacing the floor of his condominium, surrounded by half-eaten takeout containers, piles of legal documents, and transcripts of interviews with bystanders, reliving the moment Henson forced him against the hood of his own car in search of contraband that never existed. Though physically exhausted, Emmanuel's determination only solidified, fueled by the knowledge that a successful prosecution of wrongdoing, if the evidence led to that outcome, would set a precedent affirming that no badge excused racial discrimination, no rank exempted an officer from accountability. His assistant continued to filter call after call from national figures, some of whom urged Emmanuel to run for higher office, using his new visibility to champion criminal justice reform on a larger scale, while others merely offered generic condolences that rang hollow after the trauma he had endured. The media frenzy showed no sign of abating, and every time Emmanuel glanced at a television, he saw his name or face emblazoned across the screen. The once modest district attorney now thrust into the role of a central protagonist in a critical moral drama. Quiet moments had become a luxury, and in those rare lulls, Emmanuel would feel a pang of sorrow for the countless men and women who suffered similar humiliations, lacking the advantage of public standing and the immediate media attention that came with it. At times, a wave of guilt washed over him for the undeniable privilege of being listened to and believed so quickly, reminding him that the voices of the less influential often languished unheard unless amplified by tragedy or violence. That contradiction strengthened his resolve to see this crisis through to a meaningful conclusion, leading him to vow that he would use every resource and legal lever at his disposal to expose the truth behind Henson's actions and the system that fostered them. Each morning, Emmanuel convened with a rotating cast of detectives and legal advisors, poring over witness accounts, digital evidence, and departmental records, all in preparation for the external counsel he had appointed to spearhead the investigation and maintain impartiality. The tension within the police department grew ever more palpable, with some officers resenting the high-profile scrutiny, while others cautiously applauded Emmanuel's courage to address a toxic undercurrent that many had refused to acknowledge. Death threats and hateful messages also trickled in, testaments to the deep-seated racism that lurked in the shadows. Even as waves of public support buoyed Emmanuel with affirmations that his stand embodied genuine principles of justice and equality. Standing in his office late one evening, Emmanuel gazed out over the city he had sworn to protect, aware that this single case represented far more than a personal quest for redress. It was a litmus test for the values upon which the criminal justice system was built. His reflection in the glass looked gaunt and strained, yet a sense of purpose shone in his eyes, an acknowledgement that fate had tasked him with a responsibility that went beyond any case he had prosecuted before. Sleep became an afterthought as he worked tirelessly to ensure that even if he were not the one ultimately prosecuting Henson, the independent counsel would have every piece of evidence needed to bring the matter to an unassailable conclusion. His staff watched in admiration, some in awe, others in concern that he was pushing himself to the brink, but Emmanuel remained resolute, refusing to let the fundamental question of accountability slip into the bureaucratic churn of city politics. Every day, more voices joined the clamor for justice, from national civil rights leaders to local teenagers who held homemade signs at peaceful vigils, highlighting that this was not just about an officer's misconduct, but a deeper demand for equality and respect under the law. Even so, Emmanuel recognized that the path ahead was fraught with legal complexities, personal dangers, and the possibility of polarizing a community already raw with historical distrust. Yet he pressed on, refusing to let caution overshadow moral urgency. By the end of that second week, it was clear that the narrative of Officer Stops Man, learns he's the district attorney, had morphed into a sweeping examination of policing culture, generating debates that reached into the core of every civic forum, from police academies to city council chambers. Emmanuel, standing at the center of it all, felt a mixture of pride and sorrow, for while the outcry offered hope for meaningful change, it came shackled to the tragic reality that it took a personal violation of his rights to awaken so many. His story had become a catalyst, the footage circulated like an emblem of racism exposed, fueling calls for everything from mandatory body cams to a complete overhaul of how officers were trained and disciplined. Whenever he momentarily succumbed to frustration or despair, Emmanuel reminded himself that triumphing in this struggle meant honoring the voices of countless individuals whose stories had never cracked the public consciousness. And so he continued, day by day, forging new alliances and navigating treacherous political waters, propelled forward by an unwavering commitment to repair the fractured bond between the justice system and those it served. Even under the weight of intense scrutiny, he refused to let the discourse become simply about him. This battle was about every person who had ever been profiled, harassed, or brutalized, only to see their truth questioned and their dignity eroded. Through it all, the phone messages, the interviews, the press releases, Emmanuel managed to preserve a sense of equanimity, comforting victims of previous abuses who reached out to him with harrowing accounts of similar encounters, all of which he methodically compiled for future reform efforts. He knew, in his heart, that the night Henson had presumed him guilty might end up being one of the most consequential events in his career, a pivot point that validated both his mission and the urgency of championing fair, accountable policing. Yet he also recognized the personal cost, the fragile toll on his psyche as he trudged through an unrelenting media spotlight, aware that an entire district's hopes for genuine change had coalesced around his capacity to transform fury into justice. So the fallout continued, gaining momentum with each new revelation, each witness stepping forward, each council meeting brimming with passionate demands for systematic change, until at last the district braced itself for the moment of reckoning when the investigation into Henson's actions would conclude. In the weeks that followed, the independent council concluded a thorough inquiry into Officer Henson's conduct and announced formal charges of unlawful detention, abuse of authority, and falsification of official reports, sparking a new wave of intense public interest in how the justice system would address the wrongdoing. The charges, though extensive, were only the first step in what turned out to be a lengthy legal process, requiring pretrial hearings that drew national media coverage and elicited both solidarity and backlash from various factions. Community organizations demanded not only punishment for Henson, but also the swift implementation of reforms to ensure no officer could so easily leverage bias against innocent citizens. especially those without Emmanuel's influence or visibility. As the pretrial motions were painstakingly argued in court, protesters gathered outside the courthouse nearly every day, their placards declaring support for Emmanuel's stance and urging an end to systemic racism that lingered in law enforcement agencies. During that same period, Emmanuel met quietly with leaders from both the police union and civil rights groups, forging an uneasy dialogue that aimed to bridge the chasm of mistrust, while hammering out potential policy changes that might serve as a blueprint for other jurisdictions. Although some union representatives balked at the specter of harsher disciplinary measures for misconduct, Emmanuel stood firm, insisting that accountability was the bedrock of public trust, a stance that resonated powerfully with local communities. In the midst of these negotiations, many officers privately reached out to Emmanuel, sharing concerns about a culture that too often rewarded aggression or looked away from discriminatory practices, and their confessions fueled his resolve to champion institutional transparency. Tensions escalated further when additional complaints against Henson surfaced, painting a pattern of racially biased stops, though most had never been formally investigated due to procedural loopholes and a culture of silence. Each revelation propelled Emmanuel into deeper introspection, wrestling with the realization that his office had likely prosecuted cases where Henson's testimony contributed to convictions, raising haunting questions about fairness and the potential need to revisit old judgments. While some critics accused him of grandstanding, Emmanuel's public statements remained measured and steadfast, emphasizing the importance of letting the legal process run its course while also pushing for broader changes that would outlast any single officer's fate. In private moments, he found himself weighed down by the moral gravity of ensuring that justice was done for all parties, reminding himself that the rule of law required impartiality even toward a man who had robbed him of dignity and safety. Indeed, each court appearance confronted Emmanuel with a wave of conflicted emotions. A desire for Henson to answer fully for his actions warred with the empathy that came from knowing true change meant addressing the system that had enabled those actions in the first place. In a poignant twist, Emmanuel discovered that examining Henson's past record uncovered testimonies from citizens who had never felt comfortable stepping forward until they saw the district attorney experience the same harrowing discrimination, a disturbing testament to how power dynamics can suppress truth. Spurred by these findings, Emmanuel redoubled his efforts to push for a specialized unit to oversee complaints against the police, staffed by independent investigators armed with subpoena power and protected from political interference. Though opposition from certain political factions proved fierce, public sentiment favored Emmanuel's position, and city officials felt increasing pressure to demonstrate real, structural change, rather than mere lip service. As the city council drafted new legislation, Emmanuel took the unprecedented step of inviting local activists, clergy, and even former offenders to speak on the record about their experiences with racially biased policing, adding a layer of lived perspective to the sometimes clinical process of policy reform. Over time, these forums evolved into a clarion call for holistic transformation, encompassing everything from data collection on traffic stops to the mandatory use of body cameras, as well as a revamp of training modules that taught officers how to de-escalate and recognize implicit bias. The media, which had initially fixated on the sensational footage of Emmanuel's detention, now shifted focus to document the slow but pivotal metamorphosis taking hold within the department and the city's legislative framework. Even schools joined the conversation, hosting student-led discussions about policing and justice, illustrating how far-reaching the repercussions of that one fateful traffic stop had become. Through countless interviews and community dialogues, Emmanuel stressed that this should not be labeled a victory for him but rather a collective opportunity to confront long-standing systemic ills, warning that without vigilance, momentum could easily wane. Meanwhile, Henson's legal defense, desperate to salvage his reputation, leaned into an argument that he had been overworked and inadequately supported by department leadership, an inadvertent admission that pointed to deeper institutional problems. The trial itself began under intense scrutiny, with both local and national media filling the courtroom seats, while a crowd of demonstrators outside displayed signs asserting that the verdict would either reaffirm or betray the promise of equal justice. Prosecutors laid out a damning case built upon the phone videos, departmental records, and extensive testimony of other motorists who alleged discriminatory treatment by Henson, constructing a powerful tapestry of a man emboldened by systemic leniency. Henson's defense team countered that any racial motive was unsubstantiated, that he had acted based on suspicious behavior, and that identifying Emmanuel as the district attorney simply came too late to avoid an escalation, but the court of public opinion remained unconvinced. As days of testimony bled into weeks, Emmanuel wrestled with a swirling mix of anticipation, anxiety, and regret, forced to relive his ordeal on the stand as prosecutors grilled him about every tense second of that fateful stop. The emotional toll was amplified by the knowledge that, in seeking justice for himself, he might also be vindicating the experiences of countless others who had been mistreated yet lacked the platform to fight back effectively. Finally, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on several counts, though not all, triggering an eruption of applause from the gallery and tears of relief from those who believed Henson's conviction represented a necessary reckoning for the city. Emmanuel watched with complicated emotions as Henson was led away, not reveling in triumph but pondering the many hurdles that remained to ensure one trial's conclusion would manifest as enduring reform across the force. In the days that followed, the department's leadership publicly apologized to Emmanuel and the broader community, promising to implement the oversight measures mandated by the newly passed council legislation, though many activists vowed to keep up the pressure. A wave of resignations and retirements swept the police force, prompting the recruitment of fresh faces who trained under a reimagined curriculum designed to diminish bias and encourage community engagement. In an unlikely turn, a coalition of rank-and-file officers formed a support group aimed at confronting racism within their own ranks, a bold step that signified cracks in the blue wall of silence that had protected officers like Henson for years. While Emmanuel kept a careful eye on progress, he also grappled with healing from the trauma of being manhandled and profiled in the place he served, frequently meeting with a counselor to parse through the lingering nightmares and flashes of anger. Community trust, though still fragile, began to mend as new recruits engaged in open dialogues with residents, forging connections that had been unthinkable under the old regime of suspicion and intimidation. Nationally, Emmanuel's ordeal and subsequent legal victory turned him into a reluctant symbol for reform, spurring invitations to speak at conferences and workshops dedicated to dismantling discriminatory policing practices. Juggling these new responsibilities with his core duties as district attorney proved exhausting, yet Emmanuel recognized the significance of sharing his story, hoping it would accelerate the pace of change in other jurisdictions. Over time, the local press pivoted from a near-constant barrage of negative headlines to cautiously hopeful reports on reduced complaints of racial profiling, increased officer accountability, and ongoing community forums. Emmanuel remained candid about the road ahead, cautioning that a single conviction and a suite of reforms could not erase centuries of inequity, but he publicly reaffirmed his commitment to vigilantly guard against backsliding. Despite the earnest changes underway, he sometimes caught himself hesitating behind the wheel, glancing in the rearview mirror with lingering trepidation whenever a patrol car appeared, a somber reminder of how deeply that single night had scarred him. Yet whenever he felt that prick of unease, Emmanuel reminded himself that the real triumph lay in forging an environment where future generations would not shrink under police lights, certain of being targeted unfairly. In partnership with civic organizations, his office launched an outreach program bringing officers, youth leaders, and residents together in monthly workshops aimed at candid dialogue, trust-building exercises, and mutual education on basic rights and responsibilities. Participation grew each month, aided by the novel idea of awarding community service credits to high school students who attended, and the resulting conversations, though sometimes tense, moved many to reevaluate personal biases. Media coverage of these workshops showcased a city tentatively learning to heal, no longer defined solely by the sensational traffic stop, but also by its forward-thinking approach to building a safer, more inclusive atmosphere. Emmanuel's personal life, though still haunted by the memory of the arrest, found new purpose in bridging gaps, hosting intimate gatherings where officers and activists broke bread together, discovering shared interests that transcended uniform or creed. While some critics accused him of overstretching the district attorney's role by delving so deeply into community building, Emmanuel believed true justice extended beyond prosecuting cases. It involved fostering an environment where fewer crimes, abuses, or misunderstandings occurred in the first place. Henson's appeal worked its way through the courts, culminating in a partial affirmation of his conviction, a ruling that upheld the gravity of his misconduct but slightly reduced his overall sentence, ensuring he would remain barred from serving in law enforcement. Though the man himself vanished from headlines, rumored to have relocated to a far-off state, the legacy of his actions continued to shape policy discussions, trainings, and debates over police culture for years to come. Emmanuel, in a final gesture of closure, penned a public letter acknowledging the complex emotions surrounding the officer's downfall, insisting that while punishment was inevitable, the goal had always been to prevent further abuse, rather than to claim a personal vendetta. Though the letter sparked a fresh round of praise and criticism, many found it emblematic of Emmanuel's commitment to balancing compassion and justice, a principle he had practiced in countless cases but only truly embodied after grappling with his own victimization. In a city once defined by a national scandal, people began observing subtle signs of a reawakened civic spirit. Improved interactions between neighbors and officers, more diverse recruiting for the force, and an uptick in dialogues that transcended stereotypes. Even the media narrative evolved, highlighting how a moment of blatant prejudice could catalyze profound positive change if met with unwavering resolve, community collaboration, and the relentless pursuit of accountability. As the months turned to years, Emmanuel saw measurable declines in frivolous stops, reported use of force, and complaints of racial bias, statistics that suggested the seeds of reform had indeed taken root. He remained vigilant, aware that societal progress often traveled a winding path full of pitfalls and backslides, determined to shield the fragile blossoms of accountability from the winds of complacency. In the end, that single night, burned into his memory as an ordeal of indignation and terror, became the catalyst for a broader awakening, inspiring a redefinition of what justice meant in the hearts of both the enforcers and the community they served. While the scars of that encounter never fully faded, Emmanuel learned to let them guide him, using his anguish as a beacon that illuminated entrenched injustices and helped steer an entire district toward a more equitable future. He remained humble, reminding everyone that no single official, policy, or trial could cure the systemic cancer of racism, but that real change demanded constant vigilance and collective effort from every corner of society. Yet even in the face of these challenges, he carried with him a renewed conviction that the law could be an instrument of healing as well as punishment, and that empathy and courage were the twin pillars upon which lasting justice must be built. His city, once fractured by fear and distrust, now stood at the forefront of pioneering reforms that neighboring counties watched with cautious optimism, hopeful that a similar metamorphosis might one day take hold in their own communities. Ultimately, the hardest-earned lesson for Emmanuel was recognizing his dual roles as both prosecutor and citizen, forging a deep well of understanding that shaped every interaction and informed every decision in the courtroom, as he continued his journey with a steadfast belief in the power of accountability, respect, and shared humanity.